Sempozyumun 3. gününün öğleden sonra ilk oturumundayız. Oturumun başlığı Şimdi ve Burada neler oluyor? Normalde bu oturumda 3 konuşmacımız olacaktı. Alberto Toscano, Adam Haniye ve Darrell Chester. Adam Haniye 2 gün önce rahatsızlığını bize yazılı olarak bildirdi. Dolayısıyla katılamadı. Darrell Chester da sanırım bazı izin problemleri yaşıyor üniversitesiyle. Bunu da son anda iptal etmek zorunda kaldık. Dolayısıyla tek konuşmacılı bir oturum olacak. Bundan dolayı biz konuşma süresini biraz uzatmaya kendi aramızda karar verdik. 45 dakikalık bir konuşma olacak. Ardından da 45 dakikalık bir soru cevap kısmını öngörüyoruz. Öncelikle biraz Alberto Toscano hakkında size bilgi vermek isterim. Kendisi Londra Üniversitesi Goldsmith College'da eleştirel teori üzerine dersler vermekte ve aynı zamanda Historical Materialism dergisinin editöriyel kurulunda görev almakta. Ayrıca İngiltere'nin büyük yayın evlerinden biri olan Seagal'ın İtalyancadan çevrilen kitaplarına editörlük yapıyor. Bunun dışında Baggio ve Negri'nin bazı metinlerin İngilizceye çevrilmesi ile de tanınıyor. Türkçe'de çevrilmiş 2 tane metni var, yani kitabı var. Bunlardan bir tanesi Metis yayınlarından çıkmış olan Fanatizm isimli kitap. Bir de Enkol yayınlarından çıkmış olan İsyan Zamanlarında Felsefe diye bir metni var. Şimdi sözü kendisine bırakıyorum.
Okay, so thank you very much, Femi, and to the organizers for the very kind invitation to speak at this symposium. So what I want to speak about today is a word or a term that seems to have dropped out, or in many regards disappeared, from the vocabulary of the left, at least of the European or North American left. And that word is transition. That word or that concept is transition. This is ironic in a sense because of course the recent period we have heard a lot, some might argue too much, about transitional justice, about transitions from state socialism to capitalism, or even about transitions from dictatorship to democracy. But transition, in the sense that this term had been used broadly in the 100 years between Marx writing the Critique of the Gotha program and the last serious intellectual or theoretical debates in the European left on the question of transition, which I would broadly date to the late 70s, debates involving the work of some thinkers that, from what I gather, people have already talked about here. Nikos Poulantzas being a very prominent one, but we could also think of Charles Bettelheim writing on transitions to socialist economies, and a whole set of other figures who I won't revisit here. Those debates seem to be now obsolete, and we might want to discuss whether they are obsolete, and if so, why. But it's also interesting that in recent, fairly prominent discussions on the question of communism and on the possible theoretical or even political revival of the idea of communism, this notion of transition, which after all gave much of its content and its impetus to the political orientation of Marxist theory, has not even taken a back seat, has more or less been absent as well. find it difficult, for instance, in the various collections of papers from conferences on the idea of communism that were organized in Paris and Berlin and New York, and now I forget where else, to find a consistent discussion of this question. So what I want to do today is to revisit this idea of transition, first of all, in the context of what might seem a political situation which doesn't lend itself to discussions of transition, but is rather focused on a much more defensive posture on the part of the left, which we could refer to as a kind of radical or perhaps even desperate reformism that we might find in the programs and in the political positions of groups like Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain. Incidentally, I don't mean reformism here as most Marxists do in a pejorative sense, just in an objective one, so to speak. The other context for this paper, and in a sense what I'm excerpting it from, is a longer text that was written in response to a speculative provocation on the part of the American Marxist literary theorist Frederick Jameson, who recently gave a pretty fascinating, rather perverse talk, so to speak, called American Utopia, which you can find on YouTube in full, if you so desire, in which it's very much a science fictional provocation in which he tries to argue, partly against all of the reflexes of the US left, or what remains of it, that the only possible embryo of a form of dual power, that concept more or less coined around the same time by Lenin and Trotsky, around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. Jameson argues that the only embryo of dual power that one could find in the US polity is the army, which is of course an argument which is meant to, in many ways, provoke the libertarian reflexes, let's say, in quite interesting ways of much of the US left. So I won't talk about the Jameson text in detail, but some aspects of it will surface at different points in my talk. So the aim, in a sense, is an exercise to perhaps map our political imaginary, or our political orientations, in terms of this absence, in a sense, of this absence of this term, which is, after all, absolutely central to any discussion of the theory of the state or the theory of law from a Marxist perspective. And to do so by rethinking an aspect of this question of transition, which is the one that Jameson foregrounds, that he emphasizes, which is this question of dual power. So following the fortunes and the debates around the recent resurgence in the left in Southern Europe, principally in Greece and in Spain, I think we could be forgiven for asserting that in some sense or another reformism has become our current utopia. That if the European left has a utopia, that utopia is reformism, or indeed that utopia is something like social democracy. This is very explicit in the speeches and the programs of Podemos, and specifically in the speeches and the programs of its leader, Pablo Iglesias, most notably, again, not to refer everything to YouTube, but to a speech given at the Syriza pre-election rally, where he was present alongside Tsipras and along the leader of the Italian Metal Workers Union, Maurizio Landini. Iglesias gave a speech which in a nutshell, after some very interesting and peculiar references to Allende and the Chilean coup and the whole history of the left, generally in the 1970s, he argued that we, as in we, the contemporary left, at this point in time, are not calling for the withering away of the state, are not calling for the abolition of the repressive state apparatus. We're calling for, and then he listed a number of seemingly commonsensical demands: children being fed, pensions being paid, public services not being destroyed, etc., etc. After which he argued, and he's done so in print repeatedly, that all of these claims would have been entirely non-controversial to even the most right-leaning member of European social democracy in the 1950s or 60s, and that indeed they would have been generally non-controversial amongst the center-left-leaning members of European Christian democracy as well. But that nevertheless, these were now viewed as impossible claims by a financial and elite consensus that he was obviously opposing himself towards. And I think this is also the context, and again, at this point I don't want to argue about it as a criticism or as a reproach, but just as a description, a kind of phenomenology of the European left and its imaginary at present. I think this is also the reason why the discourse of neither left nor right has to be understood in this domain. It has to be understood in this context, which is not so much a context that is, as you know, say, the various European third ways beyond left and right, but is in a sense almost before left and right, as though one could find a set of minimal demands regarding the public or the state or law that, you know, could form a sort of basic consensus, after which there then may be, you know, stronger divisions in the law. Now, in his text, American Utopia, Jameson refers to this practice of redefining the terms of our political debate in a polarizing or antagonistic way, taking them away from one's rivals and building around them a broader consensus as the core of what Stuart Hall called a discursive struggle. Jameson, however, is doing this in a rather provocative sense. He says basically that all that the official sphere of representative parliamentary politics is good for is not transforming capitalism, is not even engaging in substantial or radical reforms, is simply in inserting different twists into the political discourse. This is the best, let's say, that politicians in the parliamentary sphere can do. Jameson himself starts from a pessimistic picture of the current conditions of our political practice and our political imaginary, which is not necessarily so distant from that which dominates, for instance, the writings and the speeches of someone like Pablo Iglesias. In some sense, his starting point is that the traditional imaginaries and the traditional vocabularies of both revolutionary and reformist conceptions of the left have more or less, if not simultaneously, at least conjointly collapsed. So even the distinction, had rather fortunate distinction amongst theorists of the left, made by Gramsci between wars of position, generally associated to the frontal efforts to seize state power, sorry, wars of maneuver generally associated to Leninist focus on seizing of state power, and wars of position generally associated to various long-term social democratic strategies have more or less vanished from the strategic horizon of the left. And we can argue, and this is in a sense speaking more of the Podemos and Syriza phenomenon, that so has a more useful distinction, or perhaps a more pertinent distinction, which was the one made by the French social theorist and philosopher André Gortz, between reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms, or reforms that would include within themselves a challenge to a system of power and of accumulation, and reforms that would instead more or less remain within the boundaries of that system. The claim made by the likes of Iglesias, and to an extent Tsipras as well, is that now in a sense all reforms, understood in reforms of any kind of emancipatory, progressive, social democratic, public-oriented sort, are ipso facto non-reformist, are decreed to be in some kind of sense impossible. So I think it's telling, just as a starting point, that it appears that contemporary radicalism on the left, with its successes, with its capacities to mobilize, however contradictory, has found itself, in order to attain a kind of mass appeal of sorts, turning to what could be defined as the non-utopian features of reformism. So that basically you have this sort of paradoxical situation in which an explicitly non-revolutionary reformism, an explicit demands for changes that would have been considered completely normal in the 1950s and 60s and so on, is the rupture. The rupture is not, and these changes are not viewed, at least explicitly, certainly not in Spain, as a step towards a more transformative or revolutionary politics. They're viewed in themselves, discursively and politically, as rupture. In this context, it's difficult not to agree to some extent with Jameson's rather pessimistic claims about the enormous closure of the political imaginary of the left. What I guess makes the Podemos and to an extent Syriza positions curious is that they are very explicit about this closure. I mean, in the case of Iglesias, it's a very explicit assertion that we live in a political space in which even these extremely limited mild demands are themselves a systemic rupture, and that this just simply has to be recognized as the state of affairs. And I think this discursive situation, again, lends credence to the notion that, viewed from the standpoint of the present, this question of transition, which again defined and determined the theoretical debates and the political imaginaries of the left for that 100 years from the 1870s to the 1970s, that question has become in some sense unthinkable. And in fact, it seems almost in bad taste, given the current predicament of oppositional forces, to discuss this question of transition. Now, what I think is curious is that on the other side of this very conscious claim for a kind of ruptural minimal reformism in the Southern European left, that in the small but very theoretically active domains of what, for want of a better term, we could call the far left, from groups or theorists associating themselves with the tradition of Italian operaismo and its later consequences to the 70s, to the inheritors of the left communist and council communist tradition, to various forms of anarchist political practice and theorization, to, for instance, the centrality in many ways to much of the debate on the critical left around the question of the commons, that across all of these other domains of anti-capitalist theory and debate, the question of transition is also one that has in many ways been either jettisoned, ignored, or explicitly attacked. I don't have to go in at length about that repudiation within an anarchist tradition. After all, it's formative of much of its conceptual discourse. But I think there's a strong tendency, which I think is important to recognize, in the political imaginaries of the critical far left, which puts the question of what people have called prefiguration, or the question of immediate egalitarian or communist measures at the center of its argument, and treats the entire framework of dismantling or gradually undoing the rule of the state or the rule of the forms of value over social organization and production as no longer a question that can be asked. In some sense, I guess you could see the question of transition being bypassed or negated through two paths. One is, so to speak, the one that argues that the political situation is so regressive that the only ruptural gesture is not one that addresses the state or even the law or even the repressive apparatus directly. It's just a ruptural demand for a kind of impossible social democracy, which is of course not a transitional formation. And on the other hand, perhaps equally pessimistic about the possibilities of mutating or dismantling or transforming the state, demand that a position that denies the question of transition because the only movements or paths towards emancipation are immediate, involve either a secession or a separation from social life as it currently exists, or an immediate affirmation and practice of anti-capitalist measures. And this also means that while on the one hand the parliamentary, let's say, or organized variants of the left have fused, sort of utopia with the anti-utopia that was social democracy in this very strange moment. On the other hand, the more radical and very theoretically active groups or trends on the left have generally discounted the very question of a programmatic utopia. One of the things that one finds in arguments for the commons, for prefiguration, for communization, and so on, is this repudiation of the idea that one would set out a kind of utopian program. To use this useful distinction from Jameson between utopian programs or blueprints on the one hand and just a negative utopian impulse on the other, there's still a lot of utopian impulse to dismantle and undo capitalism, but there's a very strong suspicion towards anything that would resemble a program. And part of it is based on this claim made from very different theoretical sources, incompatible theoretical sources, that somehow the opposition or the alternative to capitalism can be lived in the present, whether through anarchist prefiguration or a production of the commons and so on. Now, what I think is interesting in these debates is that they themselves depend on historical and theoretical reconstruction of what transition meant within that century, let's call it, century of transition from the 1870s to the 1970s. And it's an image of what transition had meant theoretically and practically, which is strangely homogeneous. In fact, which is strangely homogeneous to the extent that it depicts the theory and the praxis of key moments and figures within the Marxist tradition as actually having been dominated by what then became the official discourse, official progressivist, teleological, stagist discourse of Marxism, you know, from the 1930s onwards. And I find this ironic because both the critics and indeed the partisans of conception of transition seem to present its political practice, in particular its political practice under the Bolsheviks and Lenin, as being curiously linear and homogeneous. Whilst in fact a brief or cursory attention to the political record sort of shows that in actual political practice, both the Bolsheviks and Lenin broke with about every single rule imaginable for the stepwise creation of socialist polity, for better or for worse. So much so that the famous early article by Gramsci, very well-known article under the famous title, The Revolution Against Capital, with capital being the book by Marx and not the social relation, that immediate response, in fact, when Gramsci knew relatively little, I mean, this is a text from 1917, if I'm not mistaken, about concrete vicissitudes and contradictions of the revolution, that text grasps a lot of what was at stake in the practice of transition. In the practice of transition, which was, of course, determined through and through by conditions of unevenness, non-contemporaneity, and at both a spatial and temporal level. Adding to it, and of course it was something that Gramsci had already pointed out very early on, and many others did as well, that of course all of these transitional experiments took place in situations largely dominated or maybe even overdetermined by the persistence of non-capitalist modes of production, by an extremely uneven political economic scene, and by the numerical preponderance of the peasantry, which of course at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution made up something like 80% of the population, ironically more or less the same percentage of the population as the peasantry was at the time of the French Revolution. I don't know the statistics for the Chinese Revolution, but I imagine it was even larger than that. So, in some sense then, this recognition that the problem of transition in the early 20th century, specifically in the Russian Revolution, was a problem which was very much linked to the question of unevenness and not to this teleological imaginary of stages, has also lent an argument to those historical sociologists and indeed often anti-communist skeptics that saw the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and many other socialist or anti-colonial projects as themselves actually the unconscious bearers of a project of homogenization and modernization. This comes across in a famous Eastern European joke, which says, what is communism? Communism is the longest path between capitalism and capitalism. So this is this kind of image of transition, and it's also what lies behind, for instance, arguments made, including by the likes of Perry Anderson in an important piece called Two Revolutions on China and the Soviet Union, that in fact what has allowed, and this is actually now a fairly common argument, that what has allowed the the Chinese state to establish such a potent form of capital accumulation is political organization, an ideological discipline, and a whole set of capacities that were built in a revolutionary period. So again, in this mode, then the socialist revolutions then would seem almost to be conditioned by unevenness, and then in a kind of Hegelian ruse of history, to be the principal mechanisms through which to eliminate that unevenness and then make a really subsumed capitalism possible. So behind Jameson's essay, this essay, American Utopia, which I want to touch on somewhat here by discussing the question of dual power, is the conviction, which I think correct, that to unblock the atrophied, the paralyzed strategic imaginaries of the left, new vocabularies or new conceptions of transition are necessary. In a sense, they're necessary to move beyond this deadlock between, on the one hand, a sort of pessimist, realist, but in its own way utopian attachment to reformism, and then on the other hand, a sort of conviction in the immediacy of revolutionary practice without addressing state or law in any way. Now, what's curious, however, and certainly curious for Jameson, given his emphasis on what he calls the utopian impulse rather than the utopian program, is the fact that he tries to associate here transition to what we could call a positive utopia. So this is one of the questions, in a sense, that I wanted to pose. To what extent does reviving a thinking or a debate about transition demand the construction of positive utopias? Utopias of association, of administration, of social life, of desire, which plays an important role in Jameson's own argument. Now, what's interesting about Jameson putting this forward, given that he generally tries to perform a kind of fidelity to, so to speak, the classical Marxism tradition, is that transition, be it in Marx's Gotha program, or in Lenin's State and Revolution, or in myriad other texts, all the ways to debates between Polantzas and Henry Weber and the pages of the New Left Review in the 70s, is in many ways an anti-utopian problem, in the sense that the problematic of transition was very often accompanied, it certainly was, in Marx, by an extreme suspicion for the predetermination of what the forms of social organizing would be. And I find it even more curious that in order to revive the question of transition, Jameson turns to dual power and presents dual power as itself a utopia. And I think this is both the delightful aspect of his provocation, but also the extremely counterintuitive one, since, as I want to argue, the very problem of dual power is precisely the problem of a political situation, or a political conjuncture which couldn't be anticipated, and in fact which couldn't be the object of political theory in the ways, or political philosophy in the ways that these are usually understood. So what Jameson does is to try to revive our utopian imagination by turning to revolutionary political concept and political debate, which in itself, certainly in its original formulation by Lenin, was presented as a total anomaly and a total aberration that in fact nobody had theorized before. So this is a kind of very odd move by Jameson of turning an anomaly into a utopia so we could then all think, well, what would be the embryos or sources of dual power, you know, in England, in Turkey, etc., etc. So, just to, I'm sure many of you here are painfully aware of these debates, but in any case, just to revisit them somewhat. In the period, in the interregnum between the February and the October Revolution, Lenin repeatedly presents this phenomenon of dual power as an unprecedented anomaly, as a kind of total aberration, not predicted certainly by Marx, but also alien to the mentality and to the conceptual frameworks of liberal or bourgeois politics. And in some sense, the debates, the usual debates around that somewhat abstract entity which is Leninism, and the debates around the seizure of state power often sideline the far greater challenge posed to thinking revolutionary politics by this experience, which was the experience that Lenin and others were trying to narrate, this experience of the splitting of power. Not just in the sense of the presence in the same territory or the same social formation of political antagonists vying for power or indeed sovereignty, but what Lenin saw as a fundamental asymmetry of dual power. So of course you could go back in history and find plenty of occasions in which there was a, so to speak, vacuum of power, 2 or 3 or 4 more groups vying for it. But for Lenin, what was key was the idea, what made it into this aberrant or anomalous and singular concept was the presence and the conflict between asymmetrical types of power. So in order for dual power to be this strange singular concept invented in this very strange and singular moment, which of course people who want to apply it everywhere carefully forget, there has to be for Lenin this asymmetry in types of power. This is famously, of course, the asymmetry, at least theoretically, between Soviet power and state power. And also the asymmetry even between state forms themselves, to the extent that Lenin, with others, and this is obviously an object of much controversy, presented the legacy of the Paris Commune as that of the invention, the experimental invention of a state of a new type that would be a non-state state, as he calls it at one point in this kind of strange dialectical moment, or a state whose object is its own dismantling or abolition. So we have an asymmetry, and we also have the idea that within this asymmetry, one of the this emergent form, emergent type of power that you can find in the Soviets, in the Commune, and so on, is the embryo, or what Gramsci called a state in potentia, so a potential state. This also, of course, has legal or juridical dimension, to the extent that Lenin and others presented this asymmetry as the asymmetry between legitimacy and legality. You had a monopoly of legality by a state that had no legitimacy, and you had popular legitimacy by organizations that were totally illegal, or at least paralegal in some way or However, you also have, and this is why it's such an unstable concept, and I think it's also open to debate whether dual power is even a concept, I mean, or is certainly not a concept in the sense that the state is a concept or parliamentary representation is a concept. It's really more of a problem than a concept, so to speak. And it's telling how unstable it is, because as well as the site for arguing for the asymmetry between different types of power, residual power of the state and the emergent power of these new forms, it also then becomes a classical site within the Marxist tradition for a kind of, to put it somewhat facetiously, a kind of Weberian deviation. So the notion that ultimately, and this was part of Lenin's own argument, that ultimately no state can suffer duality. And for that reason, for that intrinsic reason, dual power is a fundamentally unstable and temporary, in the very quick sense of the term, condition. It's interesting to note that, of course, Weber, in making his classic arguments about the state having the monopoly of the legitimate means of violence, famously quotes Trotsky's statements about the Brest-Litovsk Agreement. So there's a kind of conjunction there. Within this context, whilst recognizing the temporariness and the instability of the problem of dual power, it is also, dual power is also the context in which we have an attempt to think of the autonomy and of the separation from the state of this emergent form of power. However, as I said, this is presented as a temporally volatile situation. Hence the axiom put forward by Lenin in one of his texts, as he puts it, two powers cannot exist in a state. So they can, but only in the impossible, anomalous, transitory way. In that sense, dual power is an opportunity of this transitional interregnum, but it is also a threat or a risk. And it is the terrain where the autonomy and the initiative of working and popular classes can be quashed. So it's ironic that whilst dual power defines the anomalous emergence of a type of proletarian power which is different in kind or asymmetrical from every previously known state and legal power for Lenin, it is also, as he himself puts it, the root of all evil. So the root of the main potential menace. And I find it interesting in the long notes on these questions written in the midst of an important debate about power and insurrection in the 1970s by Antonio Negri in his 33 Lessons on Lenin, that he glosses or comments upon Lenin's arguments by saying that this is not, I quote, an institutionalizable juridical relationship. There's no such thing as dual power for the state or the law, in a sense in which they are an anomaly or an aberration. Parenthetically, I think this opens up an interesting question as to whether there are political and social forms that could institutionalize either dual power or various forms of asymmetrical conflict in a more durable manner. Another parenthesis within the parenthesis, so to speak, in the 1970s you also find in comments made, for instance, by Louis Althusser and by Jean-Paul Sartre in the later 70s, an attempt to use the idea of dual power to rethink the internal structure of communist parties and social movements. The idea that actually one had to begin to reformulate political organization in such a way that internal asymmetry and non-centralization and non-monopoly of power were possible. So I find it intriguing that in these debates there's also a shift from debates about political strategy to internal debates about political organization.